Okay, so good morning. Thanks for attending the meeting of the Audit Committee. Maybe just to start off to say I've had apologies from Councillor Coleman and from the convener, Paula Tovey. She's unfortunately unable to join us. So the first item of business will actually be to ask the committee to appoint a convener for today's meeting. Would anybody like to nominate somebody to take the meeting?
I would nominate Councillor Cecil John.
I'll second that.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know whether to thank colleagues for that or not. Okay, thank you, Brian. Is there anything that you want to add before we go into the formal meeting?
Maybe just for those who haven't joined us in a WebEx meeting before, just as I said earlier, if you're not speaking, if you could put your microphone to mute, and if you want to speak, to indicate by putting your hand up during the questions. Councillor Spears, obviously, who's on the phone, can just say that he wants to speak, and we'll pick that up. The meeting is being recorded and will be posted online, and we also have Kirsty Patterson from the Falkirk Herald joining us. The meetings are private because we can't allow the public to attend, obviously, but the council decided that the press would be able to sit in the meeting. So we have Kirsty with us this morning. I think that's all.
Thank you, Brian. And if I don't necessarily pick up on you looking to speak, just make sure you wave. I'll do my best. Okay, we have had apologies. Do we have any declarations of interest? No. Okay, thank you. The first item is a minute of the Audit Committee held on the 11th of November, which was a long time ago, almost a lifetime ago, considering what we've been through. Are we happy to agree that as a true minute, if we can cast our minds back that far? Thank you. I anticipate that anything that will have been outstanding will be picked up, and anything that is probably historical now, considering the lapse of time. But is there anything anybody would want to raise in that minute? Councillor Reid?
Yes, it's the second bullet point, convener, on page 10. It's about following the public pound, and it's for those funds given to public organisations of less than 10k, which at the moment does not come under the scrutiny of councillors. And I think Stuart undertook to investigate that.
Okay, Mr. Ritchie?
Yeah, thank you, convener. I thought that we were putting in place arrangements for elected members to be copied into all decisions that have been taken in relation to grant allocations provided to organisations, and if that's not happened, then I'll take that away and find out why that's not happened.
Thank you.
I'm certainly not aware of it happening, Stuart, and as you know, I've also kind of indicated a bit concern about the monitoring and the scrutiny of following the public pound. So I've made some suggestions which I've yet to discuss in detail, but that's something that we can pick up. Okay, we therefore move to the internal audit annual assurance report, and Gordon.
Yep, thanks, convener. Thanks for that. Yeah, this is the first of 3 internal audit papers today. The main purpose of this one is to provide members of the Audit Committee with our overall opinion on the adequacy of the Council's arrangements for risk management, governance and control based on the work that we undertook over 1920, which, as you say, seems like a long time ago. The report also sets out some information around our performance against our own 3 performance indicators and our compliance with public sector internal audit standards. Just a couple of key points to focus in on, if that's okay. I think firstly, and most importantly, at paragraphs 2.2 and 3.7, you'll see that we've concluded that in overall terms, we've provided substantial assurance on the Council's overall control framework. That's consistent with previous years. It's pretty much what you as members of the committee should be expecting, and it's based on the work that's summarised at appendices 2 and 3. Just very quickly in the table on page 13, you'll see that we've met each of our own internal audit performance indicators, but I did just want to point out that there were two pieces of work that we didn't complete last year just because of the COVID outbreak. One of these in relation to savings tracking will be carried forward into this year's plan. The second piece of work, which wasn't completed, related to business continuity management, and it makes sense just to wrap that up within the Council's wider COVID recovery process now. Section 4 just touches on our compliance with public sector internal audit standards. Based on a self-assessment I undertook in February, I believe that we're still broadly compliant with those standards, but will be tested independently by Fife Council's Chief Internal Auditor early in 2022. I would just finish there, I think, and ask members to note the recommendations at Section 2, and happy to try and answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Gordon, and I anticipate that there will be a number of questions. I've been passed questions, as has everybody else, in relation to things that the convener would have liked to have asked, and one of them is in relation to page 18, and it's around the duplicate funds or the duplicate payments, creditors' payments, item 2 of 171,000 and taking recovery action. Do we know how much of that recovery action has taken place?
To start off, just to give some context, there were 96 payments that made up that total. They've all been passed to the creditor section for follow-up. They are now in the process of determining whether they are definitely in fact duplicate payments, and the process is ongoing. I can come back to members with a figure as to where we are at the moment, but I know that there's a determination and a commitment to make sure that anything that needs to be recovered is recovered. But as I say, I'll come back to you with a figure if that's okay.
And obviously there's assurance within the report around procedures about limiting the opportunity for further duplicate payments to be made in the future, because that's obviously, if we stop that happening, it prevents. Okay, I'll open it up for members for questions or comments in relation to the internal audit.
Hi, Cecil.
Thanks, Robert.
I would like to ask on page 14, 5.5, an equality and poverty impact assessment was not required. If you could expand on that, please.
Gordon.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor. The guidance we follow in providing this report draws on guidance provided by governance, and it was felt that there was no specific equality or poverty impact of the report as it stands. Clearly, within some of the recommendations that we've made within audit work that we've undertaken, there are implications for how the Council deals with poverty and inequalities, but in terms of the need for a specific assessment in relation to the overarching report, it was felt that that wasn't required.
Okay, Councillor Spears.
Yeah, obviously, due to the present pandemic, it's highlighted a great deal of poverty, and especially in some areas, so I would imagine that will be taken up at another source.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, the actual practical management of the issues around poverty will come into the service base rather than within the audit, and then they'll be measured against that. Okay, any other members? Councillor Reid?
I've got one or two small points. Convenience, page 18. That's a summary of last year's programme, and under item 11, that's the self-assessment. It says broadly compliant with PSIAS. Broadly can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. What does broadly compliant mean in that case?
That's actually a really good question. The standards are very detailed, Councillor, and they set out in a lot of detail almost the ideal for an internal audit section. Now, as internal audit manager, I have to make a judgment as to whether we seek to be the ideal or whether we take a more pragmatic approach and apply the most relevant sections of the standards. So given the resource that we have, the assurance that we've had from previous external assessments. I'm content that where I say we're broadly compliant, that's really good and acceptable. I think to have gone to that stage of being fully compliant would be almost disproportionate, and it would compromise some of the things that we do in our flexibility and our reactiveness, etc. So broadly, I think is where we should be aiming.
Agreed. Otherwise, it might be somewhat egotistical, I would think. On page 26, that's the item to do with creditors. You did a sample of 25 payments, and rather alarmingly, you found that on several occasions there had been a failure to comply. I take it that you then took actions, but that's a high percentage of places where you find fault or errors.
Yeah, on the back of this, we worked individually with Services Councillor. We also set up a short life working group, particularly with Children's Services, to take forward some of the actions there. We've engaged with the Corporate Procurement Unit, and jointly will provide training and development for services in the areas where we found particular weaknesses. I think just particularly within the context of COVID, it's very difficult to tick every box every time in relation to compliance in areas like this. But you're right, the proportion of weaknesses we found in relation to the number that we sampled was a bit concerning. So yes, we've engaged individually with each of the services and procurement at that kind of overarching level to help provide a bit of steer and a bit of guidance. And perhaps just jumping forward onto next year's plan, our focus next year is very much on financial control as well. So we'll pick up on some of the issues that were raised as part of this audit when we're doing next year's or this year's work.
On the next page, 27, that's administration and access privileges. As well, no segregation of duties is very important in audit, especially those making the payment, recording the payment, or ordering things and recording them. There's some doubts. You've identified areas where there's scope to further improve the internal control. I take it that's less people coming off the getting special designation. Did you find there were too many people that had access?
In overall terms, this was a really comforting piece of work for us, because we established that the type of control weaknesses that existed in Dundee didn't exist here, so we're not exposed to the same level of threat. But yeah, just from a housekeeping perspective, there were one or two of the systems where we felt that the number of people with particular super user access could be restricted, just to make sure that access is actually aligned to need. And just sitting alongside that, just a bit more kind of dip checking and sample checking of the activity of those who have super user access, to make sure that that's been properly applied. But those weren't fundamental issues that we found here, Councillor. It was more housekeeping than anything else.
Okay, thank you. In my final point, at page 30, that's under the Equality Act. Obviously, the committees are subject to that, but you found the licensing board wasn't compliant. I'm a bit confused about that. How does equality apply to the licensing board?
The licensing board is under a statutory obligation to provide an equalities mainstreaming report every 4 years, in the same way as the council and the education services. The licensing board provided input to the mainstreaming report 2 years ago, but haven't yet provided an update to the kind of 2 yearly update. So that's something I'll be taking up with the licensing manager. The key thing is that the licensing update is built into the next mainstreaming report in 2 years' time.
Yes, but in what sense does equality apply? Is it the membership of the board, or the way in which applications are dealt with?
To be honest with you, I'm going to have to say I'll come back to you with details on the specifics of how it applies.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Councillor Reid. Any other members? We're happy to agree find what the recommendations are again. And we're happy to agree there's sufficient internal audit work was undertaken to support the balance of the assurance And the internal audit can provide substantial assurance on the Council's arrangement for risk management and governance and control for the year to 31st of March. An internal audit met or exceeded each of its key performance indicators, and the internal audit section operated in compliance with the public sector internal audit standards. We're happy to agree those.
Okay, agree.
Thank you. That takes us to having looked back to looking forward to the internal audit plan for the coming year. And Gordon, do you want to just take us through that?
Yep, thanks, Convener. As you say, this is a programme for the current and coming year. Ordinarily, when I'm bringing a plan to committee, I would set out the audits that we would commit to undertaking over the first 6 months of the year, and I'd bring an indicative but still reasonably firmed up plan for the second 6 month period. I think it's clear that this year is and has to be very different, and this plan as presented has to be considered very much indicative and flexible. On that basis, if I can maybe just jump straight to the appendices, I've tried to split this plan into four areas. Appendix 1, I've set out the work that we're committed to undertaking for the other clients to whom we provide internal audit services. At Appendix 2, I've listed those assignments that again we're committed to undertaking on an annual basis, and most of these are externally driven regulatory type reviews. Appendices 3 and 4 are really where the main flexibility comes in. At Appendix 3, I've set out 4 assignments that we'll seek to undertake as a matter of priority. And at Appendix 4, there are a further 4 assignments that, again, we will look to undertake if time, circumstance, resource, and other demands allow. Anything in this plan that's before you today that's not completed this year will be rolled forward into next year. I'll probably just finish here if I could draw your attention to the recommendations, and in particular 2.1 bullet point 2, which asks you to, if you're minded to approve the internal audit plan. But again, I would stress that approval of the plan should be on the basis that this is very much subject to change.
Thank you, Gordon. And I know that there will be a number of questions around the plan, particularly about how realistic and achievable it is, what the impact of COVID has had on the internal audit, and what it may have with us in a second wave. And I think what's really important is for members to understand how you actually determine your internal audit and the priorities within it, and is that linked to other aspects of the Council's work around the corporate priorities and the risks. So I've kind of thrown some questions at you, and then I'll let you answer those, and then I'll bring in everybody else.
Thanks, Convener. Just in relation to the deliverability of the plan, I think I would entirely hold my hands up and say this is very much our aspiration. Given an ideal world, I am fully aware that this plan is likely to change over the course of the year as things like Brexit kick in, a potential second wave, as you suggest. There's lots and lots that's going to change over the next number of months. So yes, I think there are issues around achievability and deliverability of this, but I'd like to stress that we would look to direct our resource to where it's most needed. In relation specifically to COVID, most, or certainly a significant proportion of the work that we've done to date has been specifically COVID related. So we've done a lot of assurance work around things like the business support grants, the newly self-employed hardship fund, the way that COVID related spend is recorded through the corporate finance system, the community action fund, weekly and urgent payments. So an awful lot of the work that we've done so far has been specifically in relation to COVID related issues. And I'll bring in September, there's I think a meeting of committee in September where I'll roll up and bring a summary of the work that we've done so far on COVID to committee for you to consider. In terms of how we prioritise and identify our work, you're right that we try and embed this back into our corporate risk register. So we do what we call an assurance mapping process. We look at each of the corporate risks and we look at where the assurance against each of those corporate risks comes from, and where we see gaps or where we see a history of weakness or poorer control. That's where we tend to focus our activity. And we very much do that in consultation with Stephen and Grace and the Ernst & Young team too. I think, was there anything else, Councillor, that have I missed anything there in that list of questions? We do seek to draw back on the risk register and when considering the risk register should then link back into corporate priorities and objectives. So one way or the other, it all kind of loops back.
Okay, thank you, Gordon. I think that there might be more to draw out in this, but I'll open it up to members. Councillor Harris and then Councillor Nimmo.
Thanks, Convener. Gordon, just around an issue, in fact, which I raised last year, and that's in the impact of the work on with Clackmannan on your staff and the amount of time that you have to spend on that in relation to internal audit within the Falkirk Council. And your ability to deliver those projects.
Okay, thanks, Councillor. We prepare an audit plan for Clackmannanshire Council on the same basis as we provide a plan to yourselves here in Audit Committee. We, as you can see from this paper, allocate, I think, 555 days to Falkirk. We have a similar plan at Clacks, which allocates 381 days to Clacks. That's based on a calculation of the available time that I have within my team. So in terms of the deliverability of the work, all things being equal, we should be in a position to do that. Clearly, over the course of this year, any impact on my team in relation to sickness, absence or exposure to COVID impacts on our deliverability. And also, I think it's important over the rest of this year just to bear in mind that both within Falkirk and Clacks councils, people are working on different things in different ways, working from home under different stresses and pressures. So probably for this year, we'll look to deliver as much as we can. But ordinarily, within the resource I've got available, yes, it is deliverable.
Thanks. Just around the issue of external work, I mean, note that you've taken on work for Strascaran. So, again, within what sort of time is allotted there to other client work? Because that's clearly within. Does that come out of your 555 days for Falkirk Council, or is it additional work, additional time allotted to that?
No, Councillor, that comes out of our 555 days for Falkirk. Strathcarron is only 15 days per year, so it's not a huge demand on our time. The other smaller clients, which I've listed at Appendix 1, are all round about the kind of 15, 20, 25 days each mark, which comes to, I think, the 115 total in the table in the covering report. But I have to say that the plans that we're putting to each of these other audit committees are also stressing that we're going to have to be flexible this year, and where we're promising 15 or 20 days, that might or might not be deliverable just because of how things are this year.
Yeah, and just on the back of that, I was looking at the table at 4.4. It gives a reasonable breakdown of the hours on the various other bits of work. Now, trying to make a comparison to last year's equivalent table, it's really quite difficult because we're comparing apples and pears. It's not in the same format. So one, can I make a plea that we try and make sure that year on year we're reporting the same thing in the same format? Because really I can't, looking at it, can't see, we've taken, or we're giving more time or additional time to an extra client, and I don't know where within the various bits of the system that has come out. So a plea for consistency in reporting would be helpful. I don't know whether you've got any comments on that.
Councillor, other than to say, I think that's an entirely fair comment and something I'll commit to doing. Thanks. And if there's any scope or any benefit in further breakdown of these numbers coming back to committee in September, happy to do that just to give you more visibility a bit earlier.
That would be helpful, I think, to see what the changes have been. And I appreciate that the whole thing is very flexible, but we need to have the indicative figures there for where the time has been spent. Thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Councillor Nimmo.
Thanks, Convener. Gordon, just in relation to the actual audit plan, what do we have built in as far as risks concerned if there's a second phase of COVID? Can you maybe just highlight where we are in that respect?
Councillor, I think that's where I'm coming from. If there's any second wave, then I would be pulling my team from the work that's set out in this plan and directing that resource to wherever it was most needed and most required. I think that has to just be inherent in this year's plan, that we may or may not complete any or all of the work that's in here, and the resource will be directed to where it's needed.
Thanks for that, Gordon.
On that, Gordon, can I ask how what would determine you to deviate from the plan, and considering where we are you able to continue to do the work from home and not have to be on site?
In terms of your second point, Councillor, yes, we've adapted well to working from home. It does create some issues just around seeing source documents and core documents and pieces of paper, if you like, but we've, like our external audit colleagues, we can work around that and we can get that assurance in other ways. In terms of how and if we would deviate from the plan, I think that really comes down to what the issue is, and we would discuss that first of all with service directors, and if it was a significant deviation from plan, I would be looking to bring it back to committee for your approval to change. If it was a particularly significant change, I'd be looking for your approval to make that change and remove things from this year's plan to allow that additional work to happen.
Thank you. Sorry, Councillor Reid.
Gordon, we've already spent the months of April, May, June, July and August. How many of the 5 days have you used up during that period?
Councillor, I don't have the exact figure to hand, but we have been spending time doing internal audit work for Falkirk Council on the COVID related schemes that I mentioned earlier. So the things like the business support grant and newly self-employed scheme, we have been spending time on work that provides assurance to Falkirk Council and to you as a committee. I don't have the exact number of days to hand, Councillor, but it's around about proportionate to where we are in the year.
But disproportionate to what you would normally be doing. A lot of it's gone in COVID.
Yes. Yeah.
You really don't have a snowball's chance in hell in completing this plan, then, do you?
I think it's important that we set out a plan that demonstrates to you that we have a sense of where the priorities lie and where we should be directing our resource. Now, if in practical terms that doesn't happen, we'll have to hold our hands up and say we focused on other things. But I wanted to demonstrate to you that we did have, a sense of prioritisation and to show you where I would, in an ideal world, like to direct our time. But yeah, you're absolutely right. If there's other priorities, then that falls.
Right. I just thought it might be a good idea to prioritise what's in the plan. In other words, to show us what would fall off the end if what we all think.
Yeah.
That's happened.
Councillor, if that's the case, the assignments at Appendix 4 will be first to go.
Right.
So those 4 will go first. They'll roll forward into next year. I think we'll be in a position to complete the 4 assignments at Appendix 3, but if we're not able to, then I'll have to make a judgment as to which one or number of those drops into next year as well. But Appendix 4 will be first to go.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Okay, any further comments? Based on the assurances from Gordon there, are we happy to accept the recommendation, noting the resources available to internal audit, approve the internal audit plan for 2020-21, and note that the progress will be reported to the audit committee on an ongoing basis? We're happy to agree?
Agreed.
Thank you. Move on to the annual audit plan, external audit, and Stephen or Grace, who's going to take this one?
Thank you.
Stephen. Oh, sorry.
Convener, thank you. There are two documents within this item before committee this morning. One is the audit plan, and towards the back of this item is an addendum to the audit plan. Now that starts on page 39 of this item, this agenda item, certainly on the numbering system that's in front of me. Chair, the audit plan was prepared and was shared with management with the intention that that would have been presented to the audit committee meeting on the 6th of April. Obviously, the events of COVID-19 and the pandemic meant that that meeting didn't happen, but it was shared with management and is now presented to the committee along with the addendum to provide an overview of our intended approach to the external audit of the Council for 2019-20. Important to point out that our responsibilities under the Code of Audit Practice remain unchanged from previous years and broadly fall into two areas. First area, the opinion on the financial statements, and then secondly, our responsibilities to review the wider scope dimensions of public audit. In terms of auditing standards, Convener, we're required to keep the risk assessment as it relates to the external audit under review, and clearly that's been more of a necessity this year given the pandemic, which has affected everyone across society and certainly all local government bodies across Scotland and the rest of the UK. In terms of the key areas of focus, they very much remain as they have been in prior years in relation to the financial statements. However, we have increased the audit risk associated with property, plant and equipment, recognising some of the challenges around the valuation and the judgments associated with that, and the relative size of that number on the Council's balance sheet. The other additional and important area of focus for us will be around the narrative disclosures within the Council's financial statements this year, and the degree to which they, in our view, adequately represent the operational and financial challenges facing the Council now, and how the Council has responded to that and the plans for responding in the future. In relation to pensions, we continue to focus on that as a key area of audit estimate and judgment. And in relation to that, there are two very recent developments around MacLeod and around Goodwin that we're having ongoing discussions with management. In terms of property, plant and equipment, our work in that area is ongoing also, and there are a number of issues which we are working through with management and information that we're waiting on. The other area that I would just draw to your attention, Convener, before passing on to Grace to cover the wider scope and best value, audit logistics and progress update, is just in relation to the group financial statements. Clearly, the Council prepares group financial statements, and in this year, again, as a result of the impact of COVID-19, then we will be paying particular attention to the subsidiaries which are consolidated into the group position and considering the impact that might have on how the Council prepares and discloses the group financial position. With those comments, Chair, I'll just pass to Grace and ask her to, as I said, talk about best value and wider scope, logistics and a progress update in terms of the year-end audit.
Thanks, Stephen. I just had a few areas to highlight. So within the annual audit plan on page 24, then we know that really the full work on the full best value assurance report was really just kicking off when the pandemic began to affect us. So following the lockdown, that has now been postponed, and we expect that to now happen in 2021. Early discussions are being had at the moment with Audit Scotland around about when that review will take place, and so we'll just continue to engage with officers about when which slot we think that Falkirk will fit into for that. I think it's probably important to note that we are still required to fulfil our full wider scope responsibilities, And the annual audit plan and addendum highlights one wider scope significant risk in relation to financial sustainability, and in particular the Council's medium-term financial planning arrangements, and obviously the pressures and uncertainties caused by the pandemic. Within the addendum, we draw attention to additional considerations, so things like the change in Council priorities, planning assumptions, particularly around about additional funding, and the impact on the Council's capital plan. In terms of audit progress, I just wanted to kind of briefly highlight the audit is underway at the moment. We're probably around about week 7 into the audit just now, and as you'd expect, then we are conducting the audit fully remotely, which we are just finding just takes a little bit more time. So some of the communication just doesn't flow as well as the audit usually would. And in some cases, as Gordon noted then, it is getting access to source documentation that can sometimes cause a little bit of trouble. So some of the documents that we need are in the office, or in some cases in social work offices somewhere. And so it's just taking a little bit more work to verify the authenticity of documents that we are receiving. As Stephen indicated, we're also performing more work, so in particular on the asset valuations, and we'll be asking the Council for a little bit more in terms of the going concern assessments, and as Stephen said, that will include group bodies as well. I think I'll stop there, but happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Stephen and Grace. Robert, you wanted to speak?
Yes, it's on page 25, that's page 70 on the document, financial sustainability. Obviously, this is going to be really thrown out of kilter this year, especially mainly due to COVID, and we are in a lot of ways relying on national government helping here. Do you have any sort of figures, or can you show us a way that we can go ahead regarding our financial sustainability?
Okay, I think that's a big ask of Audit to be able to do that. I don't know whether MD would want to make a comment on that, Stephen or Grace.
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, it is a very big question, and I suppose probably worth just coming back to the scope of our work in the context of our responsibilities as external auditor around financial sustainability, and it has been an area of focus every year now. This year, no different. However, what is different is that added complexity, as we've heard in other items on the agenda today around COVID, and indeed as the Council is reporting in the draft financial statement. So our focus on this will be to understand the magnitude of the impact on the Council through the analysis that officers have done and completed, the rigour and the scrutiny that's been exercised by the Council over those assessments and plans, and importantly the work that the Council has put into place in terms of responding to these challenges, and what that means in terms of the recasting of the medium-term financial plan, the impact on the business plan going forward, Council's priorities, and indeed the interplay with the Council of the future as well. So that will be the area of focus for us. Clearly, the other area that we'll take into account, as we have done again last year, was the impending EU exit, and how management and members have considered the impact of that on the future financial plans and sustainability of the Council.
Thank you, Stephen. Could I maybe ask a wee bit about a general view around financial stability across local government, and about having more flexibly able to use what funding is provided from government, whether that be capital or revenue, to particularly help us through what's going to be a very difficult time, probably over a couple of years. And because local authorities have no other ways of doing it other than dipping into the reserves, and you know, if you ever needed to use reserves, now's the time to do it, but many will use that to just plug the gap. That doesn't help the recovery, so therefore having some flexibility about what we can use by way of capital revenue having a little bit of interchange there could actually assist. So I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Thank you, Convener. It is a common story and I guess a common plea that I'm hearing across local government is that need for longer term clarity in terms of the support being provided by central government, but also the longer term clarity around any potential flexibility around how the additional costs of COVID can be funded. I'm aware that there are discussions going on amongst local government finance officers, so it may be a question that's better answered by Brian or indeed Danny in terms of discussions with COSLA and also Directors of Finance Forum around this matter.
Thank you. And certainly I'm aware of the discussions that have been had, but I don't know whether Brian or Danny want to make comment.
If I can come in, Cecil, thank you, Convener. There have been overtures made via COSLA to both national government in Scotland and Westminster in terms of a range of what have been termed fiscal flexibilities, which, if approved, would significantly help manage the position in the current year. There's a whole suite of these. There's probably about 6, but perhaps the ones with the most impact are those relating to, firstly, the capacity to spread the deficit in the current financial year over more than 1 year. I think the request is for an excessive number of years, my own personal professional view, but certainly spreading would greatly help manage the unique pressures in the current financial year. There's also in that suite of options, which I won't go through the whole lot, but another significant one relates to capital and revenue, which you alluded to, Convener. One strand to that is using capital grant for revenue, and the other is the capacity to basically borrow for revenue. Now, both those elements in accounting terms are effectively sacred cows. There's a significant Rubicon that would be crossed were these to be granted. And I think because of that, the prospects of respective governments agreeing to it are probably thin, and indeed the mood music coming back would reflect that. So the decisions are still formally to be made, and they're in play. And I think my stance is, whatever the outcome is, the sooner it's known, the better placed we are going to be as a council, any council indeed, to proactively manage the challenges that we face. But as long as that uncertainty is looming there and there's a prospect of a route forward that doesn't require difficult decisions to be made, perhaps to the same extent as otherwise would be the case in the current year, it's understandable that there's a reluctance to perhaps rush to make very difficult decisions. So the uncertainty is a pervading theme, which is perhaps inevitable, but certainly unhelpful. I'll stop there. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Brian. I think I share your views that we're not going to get much by way of fiscal flexibility. Therefore, we have to prepare for that internally within the council. And part of that is we're in the process of reviewing our medium-term financial plan and our priorities. That will come forward to our meeting on the 30th of September. But I'll open it up to others for questions or comments. Councillor Reid.
Yes, you're somewhat, not surprisingly, looking closely at PP&E valuations to avoid misstatements. Could you expand on that? Do you think that they're misstated at the moment?
Convener, yes, very happy to. So our work around property, plant and equipment under the requirements of the accounting code which officers follow in preparing the financial statements, the assets are the fixed assets or the property, plant and equipment of the council need to be stated on slightly different bases depending on the class of asset. Those are subject to valuation on a rolling basis, again in accordance with the code, and the council officers undertake that using external valuers. So our work this year, similar to prior years, but obviously undertaken in the context that at the 31st of March, which is the council's balance sheet date, the initial lockdown or restricted working requirements had very recently just been imposed, and as a society there was no active transactions being undertaken in relation to the disposal and purchase of property, plant and equipment across local government and indeed across the corporate world for those very reasons in the advent of the pandemic. So, Councillor, our focus is on using our own EY estates valuation experts to review any valuations undertaken by the Council in the year, but also, and very importantly, is understanding and reviewing the work that officers have completed to ensure that those assets that weren't subject to formal valuation in the year are fairly stated and not misstated. And in many ways, it's that area of fixed assets which will have the greater focus because the officers will need to have carried out alternative procedures to be able to satisfy themselves that those assets are fairly stated in accordance with the requirements.
There's also a tussle I noticed over the pre-2016 loans. Is this you bringing Falkirk to heel?
Not at all. I mean, this was subject to discussion in previous years across local government and debate between Directors of Finance section of SIPFA and indeed Audit Scotland. The regulations have been amended, and so this year we'll be ensuring that the Council, like all local government bodies in Scotland, are following those amended regulations.
Okay, thank you. On page 67 on the hard copy, there's a reference to Falkirk Community Stadium Limited. I think councillors were expecting a report on this, certainly over the last 2 years, as to whether in fact the present setup is now value for money. Is that something you would be looking at?
Directly this year, Councillor, but certainly in the context of the financial results and how those are consolidated into the financial statements. You may recall that we have, and we'll be following up this year again, made previous recommendations around governance arrangements. So again, we'll be focusing on that this year. And clearly, if members are considering value for money, then that's an important area that we need to recognise that work that's ongoing.
Kenneth, do you want to make comment with regard to the Falkirk Community Stadium? There was a report intended to come forward. Unfortunately, COVID came in between, and as a result, there's a review of all the council's assets.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. It does make sense to bring forward this report in line with other work we're doing in relation to our utilisation of assets. So I'd anticipate that coming forward in the next few months, but I don't have a precise timescale for it at this stage. Apologies for that.
Okay. Any further questions on the annual audit, internal audit? Are we happy to accept the report?
Great.
Okay, thank you. Okay, item 7 is the internal audit charter. and somebody is going to have to wave at me to say who's taking this one.
I'll take that one,
Right, thanks, Jordan.
Yep, thanks very much. This is just a short paper. It brings an updated internal audit charter. The internal audit charter sets out the role, purpose and authority of internal audit. Committee previously approved a version of the charter back in August 2017. This is a fairly routine 3-yearly review. The biggest change to the document is that it now covers the service we provide to both Falkirk and Click Manager councils. I think that one of the key benefits of that joint working agreement is the way that we're able to kind of streamline and standardise both the governance around internal audit and also the way that we undertake our work. So I think the joint internal audit charters are a good example of that. I think the document itself, Appendix 1, is fairly self-explanatory. I don't intend talking through that in any detail, if that's okay. So if you do have any questions, I'll do my best to answer. And if I could just maybe ask you to note the recommendation, and if you're minded to formally approve the internal audit charter, please.
Thank you, Gordon. Anyone got any comments or questions? Are we happy to agree the recommendations?
We.
Okay, thank you for that. Item 8 is the corporate risk management update. And Brian's going to take that. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Convener. So this report's an update on where matters sit with the corporate risk register. As you'll note, it's been some time, September 19, since there was last a report. We tend to report semi-annually, and obviously COVID in March kind of got somewhat in the way. I would draw your attention to paras 3.2 and 3.3 in the report, just short paras, but giving you a sense of the respective responsibilities of Audit Committee relative to the Executive, both of whom have locus in this area. And I'll touch later on in the report on some initiative that we're proposing with respect to the Executive. So just looking to draw out some key points from the report. Clearly, COVID pervades matters, both in terms of risk directly attributable to COVID, but also in terms of needing to reappraise the existing portfolio of risk as impacted by COVID. So it is a major game changer. And the report notes at 4.1 that good risk management clearly is of vital importance, and more so in these times of turbulence and change. And of course, quietly, or maybe not so quietly, bubbling in the background, Brexit looms with potentially significant consequences. During the response phase, as opposed to recovery phase, risk was managed on a day-to-day basis. But moving into the recovery phase, it's clearly important that risk is embedded within the corporate risk register and the related recovery plans. Pre-COVID risks, as I've already alluded to, haven't gone away, but they do need to be viewed through the COVID lens. Updated details of all high risks are attached in Appendix 2, which includes COVID-specific risks and existing risks updated as appropriate. Other things to draw committee's attention to in terms of para 4.6, you can see various areas of progress, annual assurance statements completed for 1920 and indeed been developed for 2021. Most of the suite of governance groups have undertaken self-assessments. As a summary of progress in terms of embedding risk management across all services is set out in the dashboards at Appendix 1, and these happily demonstrate good progress, but clearly, as always, still more to do. Also draw attention in Appendix 3 to the risk assurance map, which focuses on the high and medium risks and is designed to give comfort, having identified those risks, the various strands of activity and work that are designed to focus and deal with the identified issues. And that includes work by both internal and external audit, as well as Gordon's corporate risk team. I alluded at the front end in terms of respective responsibilities between Audit Committee and the Executive that we were proposing the potential for the Executive to do what we've termed deep dives on specific risks. And this really flows from an earlier risk management workshop where members had expressed a wish to be more involved and to focus on particular risks. So over a course of time and dependent on particular triggers, for example, the Chief Social Worker's annual report would act as an obvious focal point to review matters in that arena. So we think that's a helpful and useful enhancement to the to member review of risk and how it's been managed. So if I can just return to the recommendations at section 2.1, there's 5 sitting there. And I won't run through them. You can see what they say. So I'll stop there, convener, and happy to try and deal with any questions or points of clarification that the committee may have.
Thank you, Brian. Comment that I would want to make, and I'm sure our colleagues will recognise this, is that I'm not getting a feeling through this that there is a prominence around Brexit and the impact that that will have, or the compounding impact that that will have on the impacts that COVID has brought to us. And I'm just not seeing that being brought to the fore, particularly if we end up having a hard Brexit and our local authority areas are likely to be significantly impacted. So I'm just wondering if that could maybe be given a wee bit more prominence within the plans itself, or at least be demonstrated that we actually are taking that into account.
I can certainly give assurance, convener, that Brexit is very much on the radar, notwithstanding the almost inevitable displacement, COVID-driven displacement that's happened. But I think now it is, because of the imminency of the departure date, now coming back under the spotlight somewhat. We do, in terms of the appendix, have Brexit identified as a clear risk, and it's identified as a high risk. There's a range of mitigating actions that are a good range of mitigating actions that are identified in the appendix to deal with it. And we have had for some time a particular Brexit group led by Director of Development Services, which has been very, very proactive, both intra the council, but also engaging with related parties. There's a common interest in this across local government and indeed wider. So, convener, if I can say that your comments are well made, will certainly be taken on board. But if I can give you some comfort that we believe matters are well in hand and have been monitored. There is a plan ready to be implemented, and that will be recalibrated, refined as need be, as clearer guidance comes out from central government at Westminster as this progresses in the coming months. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. And can I open it up for members' questions and comments? Councillor Reid.
Yes, I don't want to undervalue this particular report, but on page 109 there are 19 groups that either feed into this group or feed from it. To me, that illustrates that the long-awaited bonfire of bureaucracy should be taking place big time in Falkirk. And I think one of the risks not mentioned here is the risk of back injury to members. Picking up an agenda with 262 pages, which followed a pensions board agenda last week of another 240 pages. And these are A4 pages. So we had 1,000 small book pages issued to us in a week. So I would have thought that best value calls for major change. And I think the pandemic period has illustrated that the relative lack of bureaucracy works better than the current system we have. So I just wondered if there's a way in which the 19 groups could, some of them could maybe merge or disappear, for example.
Yeah, that's a fair comment, Councillor Reid. Brian?
I feel Councillor Reid's pain and frustration. If I can give some comfort, the list of groups there have already been subject to a degree of vetting. There was an exercise taken a while back, maybe 18 months, 2 years possibly from memory, where there was a much more extended series of groups, and each one was reviewed in terms of its terms of reference, its ongoing relevance, its performance, whether it made sense to continue with the group or indeed to consolidate it. So what you have before us, notwithstanding it is still quite a lengthy list, is the outcome of that review process. And of course, the groups are constantly kept under review, and some will have time-limited terms of reference. You know, they'll be set up for a particular purpose. Once that purpose is done, the need for the group goes. Others are of a more enduring nature and have a natural ongoing life. I think also we should bear in mind that, you know, we're a $500 million organisation, multi-service, multi-function. And so the range of responsibilities that we together, officers and members as a council have, does require an appropriate governance regime. But I entirely share the sentiments of streamlining and keeping bureaucracy as limited as is needed for fit for purpose to deliver what's required. So hopefully that gives Councillor Reid comfort. Thank you, Convener.
The comfort I derive is that it adds to a recycling total, because it just bounces straight into the bucket in many cases.
I think, Councillor Reid, we're in a difficult place with virtual meetings and having to try and juggle electronic papers at the same time can just push some of us, and I do speak personally, over the edge. So resulting to paper has been very helpful to getting through some of those meetings. But I think that there is a case to be made for streamlining. I think that there can often be so much information there that you don't necessarily get clarity and be able to see a pathway there. and it then starts to compound. What are you scrutinising? Because there's just so much. But I also have a lot of sympathy with what Mr. Smale is saying, that there are areas that we do need to look at very closely. We are in a transitional stage, and I think that's probably compounded things, that the whole council's going through transformation, and we need to have robust assurances around all of that process. But again, I've no doubt that I'm sure officers would be very keen to have a reduction in bureaucracy, but sometimes they are at the mercies of others as well. I don't know whether the Chief Executive wants to say anything. Kenneth, do you want to say anything in relation to that?
Yes, thank you. I mean, I also have a lot of sympathy with what Councillor Reid is saying. I'm no lover of bureaucracy, and I think there really is that during the COVID period, there was a very high level of responsiveness. Barriers were broken down. We just did things quickly because they needed to be done, and there needs to be. We need to take the learning from that, and the thing we cannot and must not do is end up re-establishing all the bureaucracy that we managed to overcome to a large degree during that period. And if you look at that list of groups in the report, I mean, they are all there for unfortunately perhaps quite good reasons. They are part of that governance structure, but whatever we can do to cut across some of that, make it easier and learn the lessons of COVID and be less bureaucratic, I'd be hugely supportive of all of that.
Okay, thank you, Kenneth. Any further questions or comments, Councillor Nimmo?
Just a quick question, Convener, on the back of what Pat was raising. The number of groups on page 109, there's obviously 19 groups, but how many people are actually involved in each of these groups?
Yeah, Brian, are you able to comment on that, or you may not know all the membership?
No, the nature. I mean, most of them are, if not all of them, are corporate groups, so they'll represent the spectrum of services. I know some of the groups, dependent on what's on the agenda, will either limit or expand those attending to make it fit for purpose. So there's a degree of flexibility there, and clearly a number of officers will attend a range of those groups, so they don't stand in isolation, which I think is important in terms of cross-fertilisation and effective communications, and as the Chief Executive has touched on, knocking down barriers and silos. So I think they serve a purpose in those terms as well. But I'm not in a position to answer the question as asked, but hopefully those contextual comments are of some assistance in lieu.
Convener, obviously there's quite a substantial number of people involved in these groups, and there's a substantial cost which will be attached to each of these groups as well, even just in officers' time. That's something that needs to be taken into account with all this as well. I'm sure we could shrink all this quite considerably.
I think all we can do is ask for that to be taken back and to be looked at. I think that I can identify that some of the groups that when they attend these meetings to participate in the governance and assurance, it can be one or two people. So I'm not convinced it's huge numbers we're talking about. And obviously they have a number of other jobs associated. However, they also do have a key role in actually doing the risk management on behalf of the council. That's a statutory obligation. So I think there's got to be a balance struck, but certainly we can ask for the comments to be taken back. If there's no other questions, are we happy to agree the recommendations? Agreed? Okay, thank you. Okay, we now have the Falkirk Council annual accounts 1920 and the Temperance Trust accounts. Brian?
Yes, convener, thank you. So this report presents the unaudited accounts for the financial year ended 31st of March 20. And as Stephen and Grace have already indicated, the audit of the accounts is well underway. The process and timeline for the annual accounts is set out in regulation, and consistent with those regulations, maybe just to highlight some elements. So firstly, Council has elected to delegate to the Audit Committee responsibility for considering the unaudited accounts. The accounts required to be submitted to the auditor, EY, by the due date of 30th of June, and that's been done. To reinforce transparency, there's a public notice process, and that's summarised in para 4.3. And to complete the process, the audited, as opposed to the unaudited accounts you have before you today, need to be submitted to the auditor by 30th of September, but firstly to be considered and approved by Council. We are anticipating that these accounts will be considered by Audit Committee on the 21st of September, but because of the impact of COVID, there's been some relaxation in the deadline. So we do have some wriggle room there if needed. I draw attention to paragraph 4.2 in the report and the reference to the management commentary and annual governance statements, which are important contextual elements to the accounts and are part of the overall picture, but are discrete from the actual detailed accounts, the numbers themselves, and the swathe of supporting notes that in turn sit behind them. Councillor Reid's earlier observation, the committee will note that the accounts themselves are over 100 pages and it will be evident a lot of work has gone into preparing them by the due date. And I'd like to pay tribute to Danny Kearney and his accounting team, and Danny's on at the meeting today as well, to Danny and the accounting team for not just achieving that, but also the work they've done to improve and enhance the presentation of the accounts to make them that bit more reader friendly. And so my thanks to Danny again. So the recommendations, as always, in section 2, and it's effectively inviting the Audit Committee to consider the accounts, note the inspection period, and that the accounts, as I said, were submitted by the required date of 30th of June. So clearly there's a lot there in the 100 pages, and myself and Danny would be happy to try and address any questions or queries that the committee may have. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Brian. And just from behalf of the Audit Committee, I would just like to share your thanks to you and your team for the preparation of the accounts, and that there's been a significant amount of work. I think this is second or third year we've had this in a slightly different format to aid understanding. So thank you for doing that. There's a number of questions being posed by the convener. But what I'll do is I'll ask other members to perhaps come in first and I may pick a few from that, and then the rest can get passed on for a formal response, if that's okay. Yep, on you go, Robert.
Page 145 under management commentary, pocket facts, people. I would also like to thank Danny for his all too visual presentation, but there is a figure there in bold that should jump out at everybody. 23% of all children in Falkirk are estimated to be living in poverty. I think this is going to be one of our major subjects that we need to address, and not just this year, but in the coming years. And it's quite frightening. So I'm quite pleased to see our life expectancy is longer. So times can only get more difficult to finance this. And my question really is, what are we doing exactly right now to try and address especially the child poverty?
Okay. Robert, I'm not entirely sure that that's something that could be answered as part of the accounts. That's a kind of service-based response that you're looking for there. But I'll open up to see if anybody wants to come back at this time with a comment in relation to that. I think that's one that's probably. Kenneth, do you want to?
Well, I mean, just very briefly, a matter of a service response, but it's certainly true to say that during the period of the pandemic, there has been a significant focus in terms of getting food for children, supporting vulnerable children, etc. And I think the other point that Councillor Spears makes, which is very relevant in relation to corporate priorities, is when we bring that back to the council, the corporate plan back in September, I would anticipate that members would want to see a real focus on tackling poverty as we move ahead. So perhaps not directly related to the accounts themselves, but undoubtedly a matter of great importance for the council as it moves forward.
Thank you, Kenneth. Any other members? Councillor Reid?
Again, to thank Brian and staff and Danny for the work in producing this report, which, as Robert says, is very good in illustrative terms. There is a similar point to that raised by Robert, and that is the number of employees, council employees, in the lowest age group. One thing that's certain to emerge from the pandemic is the rate of unemployment amongst young people. Do we have any plans to try and address that in our recruitment policies? Again, maybe it's slightly off the accounts, but...
Okay, Kenneth.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not going to talk about our recruitment policies. I mean, our recruitment policies are, in line with what they need to be in issues of equalities and all the rest of it. I suppose that the issue of focus is round about employability generally as a priority for us, given the impact on the economy of COVID, and particularly ensuring that we focus on employability and young people, and that's relates to both our work in schools, our work through the ETU, and our more general support for business in the Falkirk area in order to ensure that the position with the economy locally and the position with employability remains strong. So I think what we're talking about here in relation to poverty and employability for young people are very closely connected issues, and they're issues about what we as a council want to see as our priorities moving forward as we emerge from the first wave of COVID-19.
Okay, thank you. Pat?
Just a quick question on 164. That's the to do with employment. Employees' remuneration. I won't speak about individuals, obviously, but in the total, the number of teachers has moving into the higher income bracket has risen, whereas those in the SGIC category have fallen. Was that the result of a teacher's pay award? Or?
Gary?
Thanks very much, Chair. Just to say that it probably does reflect the overall position in terms of settlement teachers' pay compared to other SGIC chief officers, etc. groups within the council. So over the last 3-year settlement, the overall pay award for teachers was higher than other groups of staff. So that would automatically reflect a repositioning of the overall teachers' scale further up the scale than it would have been in past years.
Yeah, I'm assuming that the difference is aggregated by the fact that there were cuts in senior staff and other services. I think that's a basic assumption, because that number has fallen, strangely enough. Okay, I'm taking it as a basic assumption.
Stuart might be able to.
Thanks. Now, I was just going to agree with Councillor Reid. That's the answer to why the numbers have fallen.
Okay, thank you. There was a final point on page 197. That's the related party transactions and their association with the Falkirk Towns Limited. Do you have a breakdown as to how that money was applied to the various town centres? 364,000.
Ryan?
How much did Bowness get, etc.?
Not to hand, but I'm sure we can after the meeting dig that out and circulate it.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you. Could I just ask, just based on what we've used before around reserves, and that year on year there's been an application of reserves as part of the budget process, highlighting that this year there's probably going to be a significant deficit, and our reserves policies to retain so much. Do you think that we're going to have to revisit the levels of reserves for retention in the future, Brian?
Reserves, I think, as has been touched on several times during the course of this meeting, inevitably are going to be under pressure. And it was also said, I think, by yourself, Convener, that what are reserves for, in a sense, if not to be used to help in unprecedented circumstances such as those that we are currently encountering. Having said that, though, I think there are important questions as to what degree you would apply reserves, and that's a matter of judgment, ultimately, but we have to have regard to underlying principles of financial sustainability and prudence. We need to recognise that this is not a one-year, one-off circumstance. There's more pressure coming downstream. We already have some pretty frightening projections on unemployment, and of course, in a number of ways that will flush through an impact on the council, whether that be pressures on revenue collection or demands for services, because central government's finances, both Westminster and at the Scottish Government level, are, to use a colloquialism, somewhat shot because of COVID. So that inevitably is going to impact on the level of grant coming through. And members may recall the recent workshop, one of the metrics that was given was the proportion of the council's overall finances that come from central government, which was over 80%. So any impact there is going to be profound. So it is a moving picture. We touched on earlier in terms of the fiscal flexibilities, were they to be granted, that would ease the pressure. So there's a lot in the mix, but I think what you've got to do is revert to core principles around prudence and financial responsibility. And I think also accepting some deployment of reserves is appropriate and indeed inevitable. That this level of judgment comes in, and the necessity to avoid using reserves as a simple expedient and avoiding tackling the underlying issues, the fundamental issues that need addressed. And as you'll have heard me say on numerous occasions at every budget meeting, you know, the reserves, the £1 can only be spent once. You know, once you've spent it, it's gone. And if it's for recurring issues, okay, you plug that for 1 year, but the issue hasn't been resolved. And all it does is add to your gap in the following year. So all you're doing in those terms is kicking the can down the road a little, but you're not dealing with the actual problem. So I think it's inevitable, drawing those strands together, that reserves will remain a key variable in the equation, but we need to take great care on how we deploy them and to what extent. And we know our auditor friends will be casting a beady eye on what decisions members take in this regard. So judgment, prudence, financial sustainability are all important reference points. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Brian. Another question that I have, and it is from the Convener herself, is in relation to page 225. There's a bad debt provision of 20 million, and why is it so large? Why is it pitched at that level?
Sorry, Convener, I'm just trying to get the page up. Machine's very slow.
It is Monday.
It is me. Sorry, my machine's just froze. That I think will be largely relating to council tax. Danny, are you able to step in there and supplement that while my machine grinds to that page?
Yeah, I'm not able to quickly get to the page myself, so but I will be due to council tax in large. This is about 90% of the liabilities that were due, but we can maybe get a breakdown once we find the figures for you.
And I think it would maybe be helpful to know if we think that is likely to increase as a result of where we are in COVID and the implications of the pandemic going forward.
Our latest figures were showing an actual improvement in our collection rates over the last month or so. So we were pessimistic at the early days, but latterly it's seen an improvement in our collection, I think.
But that may not be sustained.
No, absolutely. And I think it's got to be monitored on a month-to-month basis.
Yeah. Okay, I think what we'll do is that the other questions from Paula will maybe just submit and we'll get written answers back from Brian rather than go through all of them here today. But I've kind of picked out the ones that I felt were most pertinent and would be of interest to all members. So based on that, are we happy to accept the recommendations? Oh, sorry, Councillor Reid.
We can't forget the Falkirk Temperance Trust.
Oh, yeah, beg your pardon. Yeah.
Just a small point, Chairman. As you probably know, this the Temperance Hotel was bought by the then Falkirk Town Council through the will of Dr. Aitken, the physicist who lived in Falkirk, and then sold, and the money then assigned to help people refrain from alcohol, because Aitken's a great anti-temperance man, and then it was extended to include drugs. But if you notice, appointment of trustees is Councillor David Grant and Councillor Laura Murtaugh were appointed as trustees representing wards in the former Falkirk Borough area, which they don't. And I think up to 2017 it was always members from the wards within the Falkirk Borough that were appointed. I think that was part of the agreement back in 1919. And I don't think it was changed in 1991. But I've been wrong a million times before, and I'll be wrong a million times again. But I just wondered if that could be checked. I think the only thing that was changed was that it was alcohol and drugs, but the actual trustee membership was not changed.
Okay, thanks for that Pat, the ever watchful eye of the Temperance Trust over the years. Maybe we could get that checked out, Brian.
I may say I'm not temperate myself.
Certainly not during lockdown anyway. We'll get that checked out, and we can always bring that back as an amendment if required. Other than that, are we happy to accept? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, our final item is Council of the Future update. And Stuart, are you going to take this? Yep.
Yes, thank you, Convener. So this report looks at the up-to-date risk register for the Council of the Future Change programme. The report refers in a couple of places to reports that were considered by the Executive, and as members know, it's the Executive who consider the deliverability of the programme. So since May 2019, there have been 7 meetings of the Council of the Future Board. They've concentrated in looking at the 8 key projects that define our change programme, and these individual projects are referred to in the Executive report of the 25th of June, and the link to that report is set out in section 4.7 of this report. Members will be aware that our corporate plan and business plan are being updated and will be submitted to the Council in September. The risk register for the Council of the Future programme will also be updated as part of that exercise. Members have been involved in workshops on the business plan already, and more are planned, and dates will be dropping into members' diaries for the next sessions, which will be in early September. Turning back to the top 8 projects, the status of the projects are shown in section 4.7 of the report and reflects the impact that COVID has had on resource reallocation during the response stage to the pandemic. The up-to-date risk register for the programme is shown in Appendix 1 of the report, and that was agreed by the Council of the Future Board when it met in June, and it shows the risks and the mitigating actions. The recommendations, Convener, are set out in section 2 of the report. Happy to answer questions that members have. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. Okay, I will open it up for members. Questions or comments? The Council of the Future programme, like everything else, as Stuart said, is part a part of the whole review as a part as in our response to COVID, taking into account the impacts and looking at our financial sustainability as well. So well, you know, this is kind of looking back. We will be looking forward, and there will be an update brought to members. I would just like to comment a wee bit tongue in cheek in relation to political policy and decisions as being the highest risks associated and with little by way of mitigation. So I think that's maybe a message back to elected members in there somewhere as well in all of this. But if there's no comments or questions on Council of Future Risk Register update, are we happy to approve? Yeah. Okay. Okay, that brings us to the end of our audit committee this morning. It's been quite a full agenda with some heavy reports, so I thank members for their diligence and their questions, and officers for their time and responses, and to our external auditors as well for coming along and presenting their annual audit. I dare say we'll be seeing you a wee bit more as we go forward over the next wee while, and we'll hear the scope of the best value audit in due course. And all I'll say is please be gentle with us. Okay, can I thank everybody for their attendance this morning?
Thanks, Convener.
Thank you.
Thank you.